Across the ideological spectrum, there is concern that free expression is under attack, whether from misinformation and hate speech or deplatforming, political correctness, and gotcha pile-ons of every sort. Yet this comes at a time when rarely before have so many had the ability to express their views to an almost unlimited audience. Dilemmas of Free Expression is a new collection of essays exploring what threats to freedom of speech mean. Joining us, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, 4 of those featured in the book. In the nation's capital, Carissima Mathen. She is professor of constitutional and criminal law at the University of Ottawa. In Kingston, Ontario, Dax D'Orazio, postdoctoral fellow in political science at Queen's University. In Waterloo, Ontario, the editor of the collection Dilemmas of Free Expression, there's Emmett Macfarlane, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. And in the provincial capital, Cara Zwibel, director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the CCLA. And it's great to have you 4 with us on TVO tonight. I want to start off our discussion by just reading a paragraph from this book. And Mr. Director, I'll ask you to put that paragraph up and everybody can read along at home as they like. As the Supreme Court of Canada enunciated in one of its earliest judgments under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the freedom to express oneself openly and fully is of crucial importance in a free and democratic society. And as such, it is an essential value of Canadian parliamentary democracy. The protection of free expression is integral. The court outlines in another judgment for seeking and attaining the truth, for participation in social and political decision-making, and for diversity in forms of individual self-fulfillment and human flourishing. Okay, nice words. Emmett, where are we in 2021 regarding, quote, the freedom to express oneself openly and fully?
Well, I think we're facing a lot of challenges. We have a discomforting percentage of the population that is susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories. This is making it challenging to confront the real threats we're facing today, like the pandemic and climate change. We're facing a lot of hate and hate speech, particularly online and on social media. And we're in the midst of a climate where free speech as a liberal democratic value is actually itself subject to ideological polarization and contestation. And so I think, I don't know that I would label the problem of one of being a free speech crisis, but I would say we are facing enormous challenges about when speech is harmful, how to address that harm while living up to the ideals and values a democracy should hold dear.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, because the quote you use in the book is, free expression is seemingly under threat. So I want to know if it's actually under threat or sort of under threat.
Well, I think it's under threat to the extent that there are now a discourse and attitudes around free expression that we should be worried about. There's evidence that younger generations are much more open to censorship and restrictions on speech, more so than they used to be in a number of areas. We see controversies on university campuses around things like deplatforming and censorship that should give us some pause. At the same time, you know, if we compare Canada to most other countries, we would still say we have quite a strong, flourishing, and receptive culture around free expression. So it's not all doom and gloom, but there are reasons to worry. There are reasons to remain vigilant about free expression.
Well, let's go back 40 years, and Carissima, I'll ask you to pick up the story. We got a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country 40 years ago. How well do you think that charter protects our free speech and free expression rights?
I think it protects freedom of expression fairly broadly in terms of the general interpretation of Section 2B of the Charter, in that very early on, the Supreme Court adopted an approach under which any attempt to convey meaning short of actual violence is protected by the Charter. But, and this separates us from Americans, for example, all of the rights in the Charter are subject to reasonable limits under the first clause of the Charter, Section 1. And that's why, for example, we have laws criminalizing hate speech, and we have some human rights codes that include the ability to make complaints against certain kinds of expression. And what the court has said is that while we value freedom of expression very highly, there are certain conditions under which the state, and it does need to be the state, can limit that expression because there are other social goals that are very important. So I do think that we have powerful protections under the Charter. They are always subject to debate and delineation. There was recently a Supreme Court of Canada decision that ruled in favor of freedom of expression, but quite narrowly, and that's got a few constitutional scholars on edge, and maybe we can talk about that case that arose in Quebec. So powerful protections, but subject to, I think, some debate.
And a quick follow-up here. Do you find it interesting that our free expression rights are Section 2 of the Charter? Not Section 1, Section 2. What do you infer from that?
What I infer from that is that the framers of the Charter wanted to make it clear that all of the rights and freedoms were not absolute, and that's why the first clause is the reasonable limits clause. But what I will say is that the fundamental freedoms, which are protected by Section 2, are the first ones that are mentioned. There's no legal relevance to that point, but it's true that if you read the Charter and you start reading it, the very first section is one that makes it clear that the rights are subject to some limits.
Curious, another distinction from the United States. Let's put some numbers up here. We've got a Post-Media Leger poll. Now, this is admittedly from back in July, but here we go. How do Canadians feel about the kind of free speech they have in this country? 45% apparently, 45% of Canadians feel very free to speak their minds. And if you ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, they say they're somewhere between an 8 and a 10. 45% feel the speech is more restricted today than it was 5 to 10 years ago. And 68%, more than 2/3 of Canadians, feel that some topics are too sensitive to be discussed. Let's pick up on some of this. Cara, what does it say to you that, and I'm going to infer from the first number, if 45% of Canadians feel very free to speak their minds, I'm going to infer that 55% don't. What does it say to you that more than half of Canadians don't feel completely free to express themselves?
Well, I mean, one of the things that it tells us is that there's a distinction between sort of the legal restrictions that exist on our freedom of expression and really the sort of societal ones. Emmett mentioned, the discourse around free expression, and I think that that's where, you see people who think that being sort of censured on social media or being subject to ridicule or pushback from people about views that are expressed is a restriction on their free expression. In reality, that's just free expression in action, right? You have the right to express yourself, and people have the right to react to it. But I think, there's, and we see this in all different sorts of ways. Even when you talk about something like hate speech, which has, a specific legal definition, I think the average person understands hate speech as something quite different. And they would think that there's a whole bunch of things that would fall into that category, which the law would say is not hateful expression. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what the law, says and what we as a society sort of speak about in our normal discourse. And to the point that Carissima made, there is this clause in the Charter that talks about reasonable limits, and our courts, over time, they come up with different ideas about what's reasonable, and society comes to different ideas about what constitutes reasonable limits. So I think we're sort of constantly in an evolving state.
But I gather the point you're trying to make is that we have free expression rights in this country. We don't have consequence-free free expression rights in this country, right?
Absolutely. When we talk about free expression from a legal perspective or from the Charter perspective, we're talking about, what restrictions does the state put on us?
Gotcha. Dax, 68% of Canadians, if we go back to that poll, say some topics are too sensitive to be discussed in public. And I'm guessing there's probably a couple of different ways to interpret what that means. How do you interpret it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely indicative of something, even though I wish there were a bit more nuance in the methodology of that various polling and also public polling more broadly about the comfort people have in voicing their views publicly within Canada or actually anywhere in the world. I do get the sense that amid the polarization related to free expression, both on campus and in our broader culture, that people are only getting selective exposure to extreme ideas that might fall towards the poles of public discourse. And so, without a really healthy state of public discourse, seeing the different varieties of opinions and different perspectives on topics, people might feel reticent to contribute to these conversations because their views will just not be taken on their own merit. They will then fit into the pre-established battle lines of whatever topic is being discussed. And I see this on campus quite a bit, where people's actual views don't really line up with the snapshot that we get within public discourse. And so, without a healthy state of public discourse, where people are exposed to a wide variety of perspectives on a specific topic, they're probably going to exhibit a propensity to tend towards an extremer opinion because they can't see the variety of different opinions. And they also might be more reticent to wade in because their ideas will be filtered through the polarization that already exists within public discourse. So I think those numbers are definitely indicative of something. I will say, finally, and very, very quickly, though, that a slight narrowing of the boundaries of free expression isn't always a terrible thing. I think if people are more thoughtful and more empathetic, and I think that gradually people have become hopefully more thoughtful and empathetic in their contributions to public discourse, slightly shrinking that latitude to allow more voices in public discourse is a good thing. And so the latitude for free expression, if it shrinks a bit over time historically, is not necessarily a bad thing. The question is whether or not shrinking that latitude is merited or unmerited.
No, I take your point. I mean, peace, order, and good government, which is in our Constitution, is also a Canadian value, and we seem to prize that rather highly. And that'll lead me to our next round of conversation here with Emmett, because obviously most of you spend a lot of time on university campuses, and university campuses, unlike, say, 25 or 50 years ago, today seem to be places where free speech goes to die a lot of the time. And, I want to explore this a bit with you. A lot of students, it seems, don't want to be confronted by uncomfortable ideas. There are people who get invited to go to universities to give speeches, and then somehow those invitations disappear if people make a stink. How genuinely harmful do you think that the harm caused by uncomfortable speech or offensive speech truly is to students?
Well, I think we need to be careful with the premise of that question. Students face challenging, controversial topics every day on university campuses across this country without any fuss. My courses are replete with discussions about hate speech and hate, about racism, about abortion, about all sorts of controversial and difficult topics. And I've never faced a complaint for something a student said in a class. I've never had a student come to me and express concerns about language or offensiveness. And I think my classes are typical of the classes that are run by my colleagues. So I think we need to be careful of treating students as delicate little flowers who need protection. I think the controversies, the issues of deplatforming are the exception, not the rule. I think universities tend to have fairly healthy environments on that front. Now, the thing that concerns me is that I think we falsely pit free expression and values like equity and equality and diversity against each other. I think that's where the debate has been perhaps the most impoverished. It's not a choice between a free and open campus and a safe campus. I think what we need to do is make sure that universities are addressing systemic barriers to participation, that they're making sure groups that are often targeted by hate speech actually feel welcome and a part of the community rather than alienated from it as a result of instances of hateful speech. But I think those are systemic issues that can be addressed by other policies. It's not a matter of restricting speech. I think actually speech and free speech is imperative to ensuring equality and giving voice to people who currently feel powerless or voiceless.
Well, let me follow up with Carissima on that, because you've written that concepts such as harm and safety and violence have taken on ever-expanding meanings on campus these days. What are you referring to there?
Well, the idea that the perception of what is harmful to oneself now, in some controversies, includes just things that are said or ideas that are being discussed, and it's not just on campus at all. This is also in the political realm, and the issue then becomes the difficulty of adjudicating or deliberating on what that harm is and how it can best be addressed in terms of an initial allegation. And one of the things that's happened, I think, in the last 15, 20 years is we've had this enormous democratization of the means by which we express ourselves, which is wonderful, right? We have now the ability to reach many more people than would have been the case, but that also can have the result of amplifying what would have been quite localized, even mundane conflicts into national, international controversies. And that, I think, can have an impact on how university administrations approach a crisis or a controversy, and that they are now concerned that it could spiral out of control and reflect on the university in a very negative light. So that's, I think, an extra consideration that was not present, frankly, prior to the internet.
Well, Maclean's magazine did a poll on this, admittedly, again, going back a couple of years, but here's what they here's what they discovered on that front. 47% of university students surveyed wanted their campus to be open to all manner of speech and ideas. But 53% of university students wanted a campus safe from disagreeable ideas. Cara, what do you infer from that?
I mean, safe from disagreeable ideas. I don't even think I understand what that means. And I think that there's going to be, it's such a subjective idea of what we allow. I think that, it concerns me that people feel there's sort of a right to not be offended. And, we've seen even the case that Carissima mentioned at the Supreme Court of Canada, most recent decision on freedom of expression was a 5-4 split between judges who thought that a comedian's comments were protected by the charter, and 4 judges who would have found liability for what was understood to be artistic expression, a performance, a comedy performance. Not to say that it wasn't hurtful to the target, and not to say that people don't really experience the harm that they say they experience when they hear ideas that put them at the center and that put a bullseye on their back. But that is the price we pay, I think, for living in a democracy, that we accept some level of offense, some level of disruption. Because in the end, it's better if people can express themselves. And there's also a benefit, I think, to hearing. I like my racists where I can see them, right? I like to know what people think, and I think that's better than the alternative. But obviously, it sounds like on based on that poll, it's a close to 50-50 split, and even a little more tilted towards the side of safety. But I agree, that with Emmett, that it's a false dichotomy, I think, between safety and freedom. We really need one in order to achieve the other.
Well, okay, Emmett, I'm going to go to a fast follow-up from you on this, though. I mean, you told us a moment ago that your students are, I don't think you used the word bombarded, but let's say exposed to ideas that are uncomfortable and occasionally offensive, and we shouldn't treat them like snowflakes, and they can handle all of this. And yet here's the majority of students in this survey saying they want a campus safe from disagreeable ideas. I'm pushing back. What do you say?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're answering a survey question that's giving them a false choice between two values. I think if you ask them in the abstract, do you want your campus to be free, we'd see overwhelmingly yes. And if you ask them, do you want your campus to be safe, they'd overwhelmingly say yes. I think, when it comes to the question of less freedom equals more safety, all you have to do is look south of the border, where states are currently banning the use and invocation of critical race theory as an example of less free equals less safe.
All right, Dax, let me bring you into this with the example of Ann Coulter. For people who don't watch a lot of American cable television, I should tell them, I guess, that Ann Coulter is well, some people call her controversial. Some people think she's pretty reprehensible. She has a lot of very unusual things to say. But 11 years ago, the University of Ottawa invited her to give a speech, and a lot of people raised a stink, and the invitation was rescinded. You looked into this case. What did you learn?
I'll just give a little bit of background before I delve into the case. So it seems like amid contemporary events where we can see in a really concrete fashion how there just are expressive harms that we ought to be worried about, people are less persuaded by perhaps a principled defense of free expression, some of the things that we outlined at the beginning of this segment. And so I'm really curious at looking at some of the strategic cases for free expression. Some might say that a strategic case for defending free expression is no defense at all. But in the face of not being able to persuade a not insignificant amount of people, I really do think examining strategic cases for free expression is vital at the moment. And so what I try to do in examining this case at the University of Ottawa is to ask first, what are the actual theoretical justifications for deplatforming? And my argument is that even if we have sound moral and intellectual justifications for deplatforming, I should say that rarely do we, if ever, have those on a campus, of course. That doesn't mean that there is a good strategic case for a specific form of restricting expression. And so if there is, for example, a harm reduction impulse at the root of restricting expression, as it was in this case, as the primary justification for deplatforming Ann Coulter, we really need to think through a bit better what reducing the impact of ostensibly harmful expression would look like. I think this is a classic case that's played out infinitely, in which we have someone who flips the script quite easily, garners the moral and intellectual high ground, is given awe-inspiring media coverage, and their ideas are given, orders of magnitude more currency in contemporary public debate. And so if the impulse is to minimize the impact of ostensibly harmful expression, deplatforming often does quite the opposite. And so that's a strategic paradox that I think people really need to grapple with on campus and in our culture more broadly.
Let me follow up with Carissima on that, because I know she was invited in 2011 and you joined the University of Ottawa in 2011, but I don't know if you were there yet when she was there. Were you?
I was not, no. It was some months later that I was.
Some months later. Okay. Well, I'm sure it was a hot topic of conversation when you arrived on campus in December of 2011. What was the verdict on whether or not Ann Coulter should have or should not have been allowed to speak at that university?
I don't know that there was a settled verdict. It will shock you to discover. I think that in that moment, this was Dax's article is really helpful in that his chapter is really helpful in that it goes back and talks to people when they've had some years to reflect. I think in the moment there were certainly would have been people who absolutely thought that was the right thing to do. There would have been others, and I would just say I'm among them, who thought that the entire incident really backfired, and it didn't necessarily send the message that those who were opposed to what Ann Coulter says routinely would have hoped. And it's also very difficult to control the narrative that develops in the media and in popular discourse. about what exactly happened in that instance, who was responsible for the decision. That was clearly played up to whichever side was recounting the story to their advantage. So I think a mixed verdict on that.
Okay, let me follow up with you, though. I guess I'd put myself in the category of those who think Ann Coulter is closer on the continuum to reprehensible than controversial. Having said that, do you think the tender sensibilities of the students of the day would have been overly damaged by letting her speak, say her piece, and as Cara just said a moment ago, you like to see your racists in full bloom in public so you know where they are?
I don't. I have a fairly high tolerance for controversial speech in a university above all other places. I do think that there is a role for protest. And this gets into a difficult relationship between the audience and the speaker, and what we call, for example, the heckler's veto. And there's all kinds of really interesting discussion about that. But in general, I think that particularly once an invitation has been issued, a university has to tread extremely carefully before it would ever revoke that invitation. And certainly the communication that was publicly offered that Coulter's speech might actually run afoul of the criminal code, I think that's also that's a weapon that you want to be very, very careful about employing.
Gotcha. Cara, let me bring you in here. The CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which you represent here tonight, has 5 core beliefs. The first 2 are equality and fundamental freedoms, equality coming in first. Is that the most important value?
So I would say, just like we often hear our courts say there's no hierarchy of rights, at the CCLA, we would also say that's true. And I work really closely with my colleagues and with the lawyers that we work with and with our board to try to reconcile these things, to work out how to achieve the right balance. And it's not always obvious, and it's not always easy. And certainly, there are people who think we are sometimes on the wrong side. But I think it is something that can be worked out, and I wouldn't put one above the other. And I think we have to realize that as much as we sometimes cast free expression as doing harm to marginalized people, to minorities, it's also been the tool for achieving equality. I mean, the right to protest, the right to speak out about injustice these are the tools that people have used, oppressed people have used to achieve great things. So I don't think it's one over the other. It's certainly not easy. We were in court, not defending Ernst Zundel, but agreeing with his position that the spreading false news provision of the criminal code was unconstitutional. There are some who see that as a loss for equality, but we believe that it's one of the ways that we can further the goals of achieving equality.
Less than 5 minutes to go here, and Emmett, let me bring you back in for a bit of a comparison between right and left on this one. You write that free speech is increasingly seen to be associated with the right wing of the ideological spectrum. And to be sure, in the United States today, the right wing seems to be far more interested in free speech, much of which is quite bizarre and quite wacky, but it is legal. I guess having said that, the question is, do you think the left has sort of given up on free speech as a prime, significant, core right of a democratic society?
I mean, I worry that there's a segment of people on the left who have decided to cede free speech as a value to the right-wing provocateurs who sell themselves as champions of free speech, while recognizing that they do so in a completely hypocritical way, right? So you're right. The right in the US and in Canada often leverage free speech as a value to say odious things, to say completely wacky things, but they're not actually principled defenders of free speech. And as I mentioned earlier, the right-wing governments in the US currently banning discussions of slavery and its systemic effects and critical race theory generally are proving the hypocrisy undergirding their views. And the left makes a mistake when it assumes that these free speech values is something that's pitted against equality and social justice. I actually think the hate speech law debate is a distraction that prevents us from making strides towards more equality. Because we decide, well, we allow censorship against odious individuals, that's fine, and then that's all we need to do. But hate speech isn't this linear thing causing hate. Hate speech is evidence of hate, and we're not addressing the root of hatred in society. We're not considering the more robust long-term policy measures that need to be made to try to combat hate. We're just combating a symptom of hate, which is hate speech. And I think that's a big mistake.
Dax, what do you say about that? Do you think the pursuit of those who engage in hate speech takes us down the wrong path?
Yeah, I think Emmett has made a really persuasive case, and I think it's a vital point to underline. To rewind just a bit, if we're trying to understand how approaches to free expression have changed over the last few decades, I think the most noticeable difference is that, particularly on the left, there is a much more intense and noticeable skepticism of free expression, not just on campus, but in broader society and culture. I think at the root of that is some added nuance or complexity to this concept of harm. The problem is that universities and other institutions have essentially adopted the position that any invocation of harm necessarily means that there needs to be a restriction of expression somehow. So the mere invocation of harm means that there should be some form of expressive restriction. I think that we can actually do two things at once. I think that we can recognize that expressive harms, and they are real, material, and concrete, are distributed disproportionately, and that's incredibly unfortunate. And we should do our best to mitigate that and do as Emmett said, which is address the systemic roots of things like hate in society. So we can recognize that while also recognizing that we need open and free inquiry and debate within Canada and around the world. So I don't think that these normative principles to which we should strive are in endless conflict on campus or anywhere else.
Well, we have enjoyed hearing you speak freely about this issue tonight on TVO, so thanks to Cara, Faith, Zwibel from the CCLA, Carissima Mathen from the University of Ottawa, Emmett Macfarlane, the editor of Dilemmas of Free Expression from the University of Waterloo, and Dax D'Orazio, the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Kingston. We're grateful to all of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. Many thanks.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.